crucial events, second opinions from other eyewitnesses, not to mention the etymology of certain words that were fast losing usage as the Arabic language became diffused among non-native speakers. So as the Muslims spread out, the Arabic language became diffused because non-Arabic speakers began to take on the language, and words began to lose their meaning because non-Arabs were now speaking the language and not enunciating the language properly. So they began to record the Arabic language. Please remember, in the beginning, in the times of the companions and the early tabi'een, in the mushafs of the Qur'an, in the collected pages of the Sunnah, there were no consonantal markings. There was no way you could have known the difference between a kha, a ha, and a jim unless you were an Arab. If you look at manuscripts today in Arabic, any manuscript is pretty much written out like that. If you want to read Imam Muwafiquddin Ibn Qudama yourself, or Sheikh Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani yourself, his manuscripts, his own handwriting, you will nearly have to become an Arab in order to do so. Because these people wrote without, never mind the vowelings, the fatha, dhamma, and kasra, they wrote without consonantal markings. So you would have to know what these words meant. So people used to approach Ibn Abbas regarding the Mus'haf and say, and famously, there's the historical incident in the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, in which someone said to Ibn Abbas, is it hal min muddakir or hal min muddakir? He said, no, it's hal min muddakir. Okay. And they went. That's how it was, because non-Arabs were coming, they couldn't understand the Mus'haf. And then there were different ways that certain ayat in the Quran could be read. Right? So those of you here that have read Fatiha all your life, Maliki Yawmiddin, you've read that all your life. But in the Mus'hafs of Ali, Uthman, and thousands of other companions, Maliki Yawmiddin, there's no alif. There's no alif. In fact, in all the mushafs that Uthman sent out to the major centers of the Muslim world, there's no alif in Maliki Yawmiddin. There's no alif. Now, both of these were recited by the Prophet ﷺ. They both were. They were both revealed. But to keep situations from happening, the companions had to explain when certain ayats were recited. They had to explain it. لا تسمعوا فيها لاغية. Surah Al-Ghashiyah. You shall not hear in there, in the paradise, any false words. لا تسمعوا فيها لاغية. No false words will be heard therein. لا تسمعوا, لا تسمعوا. Both valid. وَالضُّحَى, the daybreak. وَالضُّحَى, the daybreak. التوراة, the Torah. التوراة, speech of Allah. It's all the speech of Allah. But these slight differences. عليهم, عليهم. These differences. If there's anyone that's been to North Africa and has heard the qira'ah in North Africa, you will immediately know that this is not what we may have grown up with in such and such country. But it's the speech of Allah. It's the different ways that it has been given. And the companions recorded this to make sure. You will find in this commentary of Ibn Abbas that he also counts the number of letters in each surah, the number of words in each surah, the number of ayat in each surah. We actually can count down all 6,236 ayat, all 97,173 words, and all the 323,000 and so forth letters. People don't even know how many words are in the Constitution of the United States, and people follow it. We know everything about this book that Allah has revealed to us that He wanted us to know. It's important. So in the students of the students, the tabi'een, commentaries on the Qur'an and then the Sunnah began to appear. So you start to find tafsir literature appearing by itself. No longer are you finding seerah with it. Tafsir literature is appearing unique and by itself, where you're finding just the ayat being discussed with either reference to the Sunnah or what have you, but these ayat are being dealt with purely by themselves. Ibn Abbas, Wahab ibn Munabbih, and his brother Hammam, Ka'ab ibn al-Ahbar, Abdullah ibn Salam, our mother Aisha as-Siddiqa, and legions more made it a point not just to preserve the Arabic, but the order in which the Quran should be read, the ways in which some passages can be read, and the major scholars of the Quran. So it was made a point by the companions and their students what these ayat meant, the application in Arabic, and how they could be read. Like, for example, when an ayah ends with a ta marbuta, it is pronounced with a ha sound. This is something that's taught. This is something that's taught. And sometimes you'll see the word rahmah and you pronounce it rahmah. But at other times you see it and you pronounce it rahmat. And you have to know when it's supposed to be read in those ways. When it's supposed to be explained. When you have an alif that's mahmuz, when there's a hamza. As-sama 3. Or between 3 and 6. Right? You have to know how these things are to be recited when they're given. Because the Quran came like this. That's why it was so powerful. Because the Quran was recited with its tajweed. And so people preserve these things and they preserve the Arabic of the Quran. So it's for this reason that we have so much information about the Quran. There is no book in history that has been studied and examined so much. And those aren't just my words. Those are the words of the Encyclopedia Americana, page 494, under the chapter on the Quran. There's no book in history that's been as studied as the Quran. Every time you turn around, they're stumbling across old copies of mushafs, old personal copies that people wrote down for their libraries. Because the Quran is coming from mouth to ear. It's coming from mouth to heart. So when you're learning things from the ulama or from the sheikhs or from the teachers, they're teaching you memory. They don't always depend on the book. And so when people are listening to your qira'ah, sometimes you'll see men in a room or people in a room gathered around and they're listening to a young man recite Quran and they don't even have their mushafs open. Because it's not about just the pages itself. It's about what's been put in the heart as well. And so that's why before mushafs will go out to the world, they're always checked over by huffaz to read them through and then listen to them. And to make sure that the noon is elongated in the way it's supposed to be and how it's not supposed to be. And is the alif, does it have a medda on it? In wal-Dali, does it have all? They're looking at all these areas. All these issues. The tahzeeb of the Quran, where sometimes you can recite the whole Quran in 3 days. There's markers in the mushaf for that. You can recite the whole Quran in 7 days. There's markers in the mushaf. The whole Quran in 30 days. Markers in the mushaf. The whole Quran in 60 days. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said so. His most famous incident was to make khatam of the Quran every 7 days. That's his most famous statement. And that's why Anas ibn Malik, it's mentioned about him what in the Musnad? It's mentioned about him what? That he, whenever he used to complete the mushaf at the end of the week, he would do khatam of the Quran and gather his family around food. It's something that we can see traces of it in the community here. but it should be reinvigorated and brought back to life because it keeps the Quran. The Quran is a living speech. That's why the Quran is not called just Al-Kitab, just the book. It is a book, but primarily this revelation is called Quran, the recital. It's read, it's recited. So a Christian will come to you and say, yes, the Bible's been translated into over 2,300 and such languages. Yeah, but who's reading the thing? No one. That's why no one understands it. The Quran is only in a handful or so. Who's reading it? Everybody. Everybody's got copies of it. Urdu, Afrikaans, French. But the point is, everyone's reading it. You gather 2 Christians in a room, you get 5 opinions. You have 1 book in front of them. What's going on here? This is the situation. So the speech of Allah has been preserved. Now there are different types of tafsir. When we're talking about tafsir in this class, there are different types of tafsir. So I don't want someone to think, oh, the tafsir that we're doing, it's uniform and there's only one type of tafsir. I've chosen the particular author and the type of tafsir that we're doing for a reason. And I hope, inshallah, that at the end of this first class, you'll understand why. Now, there may be a slight overlap, but these are general statements. The following types of tafsir are self-explanatory. Self-explanatory. The Quran is explained by referring only to other verses of the Quran with minimal reference to the Sunnah. The purpose of such a tafsir is to assist the student in understanding themes and rare words found only in select passages that clarify each other. Adwa'ul Bayan fi Idah al-Qur'ani bil-Qur'an by Imam Muhammad al-Amin al-Shanqiti is a classic example of this particular type. Imam al-Shanqiti, while citing fiqh rulings, references to the hadith literature, creedal foundations, and his rulings on current events, makes his main objective to introduce the reader to the language of revelation and the perfections within the pages of the speech of Allah. This is volume 1 of Adwa al-Bayan fi Idah al-Qur'ani bil-Qur'an by Imam Muhammad al-Amin ibn Muhammad Mukhtar al-Jakkani al-Shanqiti. Shanqit is just the word that, the original word used for what people are calling Mauritania now. This book, this tafsir is, some printing houses have it at 11 volumes, some have it at 19. It depends on the size of the font and the printing and so on and so forth. But this book, this alim, is coming from a long line of ulama from Mauritania. Mauritania has a history of producing these type of people. And this work, you'll look within it when it was first, because it was given to me as a gift by a Muslim brother from Lebanon. And he said to me, because him and I, we always used to listen, although he died in 1971, we used to sit and listen to Imam Muhammad al-Amin al-Shanqiti's durus, because his durus rhymed. And as he spoke his durus, it sounded like he was reciting, he's reciting a nasheed. This is how the Mauritanians, some of them do their durus. So we used to listen to his durus, and it became easy for us to memorize them because he would say, وَقَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ فِي كِتَابِهِ, and he would just say these things, and he would move with such speed, and he would flow, and he would quote a hadith, and then he would stop at a point when it was at the end of a particular text or what have you. He must have memorized hundreds of texts, hundreds of them. And this tafsir of his is designed for you when you find words in the Quran, like wherever the word, for example, wherever the word qari'ah has occurred, he gathers it all together, discusses the Arabic of what that word qari'ah means, and if there's any references to it in the Sunnah. Right? Where the word ghashiyah occurs, he gathers everything together and he discusses it. And then he tells you, this is what this Arabic word means. And this is its application. Where there's certain flourishes in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses language that the scholars describe as majaz or metaphorical. He gathers all of them together and he discusses it with you.